Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You know, you open your closet, you reach for a shirt, and you put it on.
Right. It is a completely mundane daily action.
Exactly. You might choose a specific color because it suits the season, or maybe you grab a jacket with a particular designer logo to signal something about your personal taste.
You make a choice, and then you just walk out the door.
You do. But today, we are consulting a really deep stack of sources. We are talking about the Theodosian Code, the Justinian Code, the 10th century Book of Ceremonies, and translations of Byzantine guild regulations like the Book of the Prefect.
All of which paint a picture of a society where that entire concept of personal choice simply did not exist.
Not at all. We are looking at the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople.
Wow.
And in this society, the fabric on your back, the specific dye in your threads, and the embroidery on your sleeve, well, they dictated your exact legal and social right to exist in the hierarchy.
It is a totally different way of viewing clothes.
It really is. So this is a deep dive into Byzantine dress as part of our History of Clothing series.
The transformation from the relatively simple draped garments of classical antiquity into this highly regulated system is essentially a study in state control.
A total monopoly.
Yes, the Byzantine state held an absolute monopoly over what you wore. It was a strictly regulated, legally binding visual language of power, religion, and diplomacy.
So to understand the clothing itself, we have to start with the raw materials, right?
We do. Because the foundation of this entire visual system rests on two highly controlled elements, silk and very specific shades of dye.
I think we should establish the timeline and geographical reality first, just to orient you. Following the establishment of Byzantium by Emperor Constantine in 330, the empire shifted its center of gravity.
Right, moving east.
Exactly. The western half of the Roman Empire eventually crumbled, and this eastern half, sitting right on the Bosphorus, became increasingly isolated from Western traditions.
And as that separation deepened over the centuries, the classical simplicity of Roman dress began to give way to heavy Eastern influences.
The textiles themselves became the primary display of the state's wealth. Silk really transitioned into the ultimate status symbol.
And the sources reveal that Byzantine silk was far more complex than a plain weave. The state and the elite classes favored these heavily patterned brocades.
Right. They were not just wearing flat, shiny fabric.
No, these textiles featured really complex geometric patterns, figurative designs showing eagles, lions, or even elaborate religious scenes.
And dense floral motifs, too, which were heavily influenced by the Arabic and Islamic textile industries that the Byzantines were interacting with.
Right, through both trade and conflict. And the quality of the silk was meticulously controlled to ensure it caught the light and projected this undeniable aura of wealth.
But having the fabric is only half the equation here. The color of that silk was where the true authority resided.
Absolutely. The most critical element in the entire Byzantine wardrobe was the imperial purple.
And the biological and economic effort required to produce this specific color. I mean, it is difficult to overstate. This was not a synthetic dye you just mix up in a vat.
No, it was a biological secretion derived from the murex sea snail. Primarily two species, Murex brandoris and Murex trunculus.
The extraction process outlined in the sources is highly labor-intensive and incredibly costly.
Just to produce enough dye for a single garment, you required harvesting thousands upon thousands of these small snails.
Because workers had to extract a tiny gland from each individual snail, right?
Exactly. And the secretion inside that gland is actually colorless at first.
That is a fascinating detail. It doesn't start purple.
No, it only changes color when exposed to specific amounts of light and air. That initiates a photochemical reaction that turns the fluid from yellow to green, then blue, and finally into those highly sought-after shades of purple and red.
And based on the chemical makeup of those two different snail species, the resulting color was not just a single uniform shade of modern purple.
Right, it ranged significantly, from dark, almost black-looking deep purples to very bright, striking reds.
Now, Tyrian purple had been famous throughout the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. But in Byzantium, the state aggressively guarded it as an exclusive asset.
This is where we see the implementation of severe sumptuary laws. The state codified precisely who was allowed to wear these materials.
And we can track this legally in the texts. The Theodosian Code, published in 438, and later the Justinian Code, compiled between 529 and 534, they strictly regulated the consumption of these luxury goods.
The law explicitly banned non-imperial individuals from wearing gold-embroidered silk or cloth dyed with authentic imperial purple.
Let's unpack this with a modern comparison just to make it relatable. We have intellectual property laws today, right?
Mm.
If a company uses another company's trademark logo, they get sued in civil court, they pay a fine, maybe they issue an
A
apology.
financial penalty, basically.
Right. But in the Byzantine Empire, wearing Tyrian purple or a specific grade of gold embroidered silk if you were not the emperor was not a civil dispute.
No, it was legally defined as treason.
Exactly. The
Yep.
punishment was death.
The state maintained this absolute monopoly through specialized palace workshops that were dedicated solely to supplying the imperial court.
But the control extended far beyond the palace walls. The text, known as the Book of the Prefect, details the regulations for non-imperial silk guilds operating in Constantinople.
Right. These guilds were permitted to produce certain garments for the general market, but they were legally bound to use only specific regulated shades.
The sources indicate they could use peach or green-tinted purples, but the deep, true reds and blues of the Murex purple were strictly off-limits to them.
Completely off limits.
I want to look at the logistics of this because declaring a law is one thing, but actually enforcing it is another. If someone acquired a forbidden purple silk through a black market or a foreign trader, how did the state actually police what a person wore inside their private home?
And what happened to those garments once they were discovered? Well, enforcement relied on a really comprehensive network of guild overseers and informants. They reported directly to the eparch, who was essentially the mayor or chief of police of Constantinople.
So it was a deeply surveilled society.
Extremely. Prohibited goods were subject to immediate confiscation, even from private homes.
Hmm.
And once confiscated, these garments were absorbed directly into the imperial treasury.
So the state just repossessed the wealth.
Exactly. And the highly public nature of Byzantine society made hiding these items nearly impossible anyway. Servants, neighbors, rival merchants, they were all incentivized to report infractions.
Because wearing imperial purple was interpreted as a visible physical claim to the throne.
It was a direct challenge.
So the state treated a piece of fabric with the same severity as assembling a rebel army.
Yeah.
But what was the underlying rationale for such extreme measures? I mean, why dedicate so much administrative energy to policing a color?
The rationale operated on multiple levels. Economically, there was a deeply ingrained historical fear dating back to the earlier Roman Empire.
Right, the drain of resources.
Exactly. In previous centuries, the expenditure on imported silk from the East was so massive that it threatened to exhaust Roman silver reserves.
It was enriching foreign markets and middlemen, particularly the Persians.
So sumptuary laws initially helped curb that economic hemorrhage by restricting who could participate in the silk trade.
It functioned as a rigid form of trade regulation and economic protectionism.
It did. But as the empire evolved, the primary function of these laws shifted to stabilizing the social order. The visual hierarchy became paramount.
And the cultural and religious meaning of the color purple shifted too, didn't it?
Significantly. In antiquity, it merely denoted extreme financial wealth. If you had money, you wore purple. But in the heavily Christianized Byzantine Empire, the color acquired a sacred divine nature.
It became intrinsically linked to Christian theology.
Yes. From a symbolic standpoint, the deep red purple of the Murex dye physically represented the blood and the sacrifice of Christ.
So by claiming exclusive legal rights to that color, the emperor was not just hoarding wealth.
No, he was visually cementing his role as Christ's direct representative on earth. To wear the emperor's color was to challenge the divine order itself.
That is a massive shift in how a piece of clothing operates in society. So we have established that the state possessed absolute control over the raw fabric and the dye.
The foundational elements.
Right. Once those materials were secured, we have to look at how they actually cut, draped, and constructed the garments. How did these highly regulated materials translate into the foundational layers worn by everyday citizens and high-ranking officials?
Well, the most profound structural shift in Byzantine fashion was the total abandonment of the Roman toga.
The toga is entirely gone. The classical image of a Roman senator draped in a flowing, white, semicircular woolen toga, it disappears almost entirely from the sources.
The only exception mentioned is the toga picta, which was retained strictly as the official ceremonial dress for consuls.
But even that was phased out by the middle of the 6th century.
Because the toga was deeply impractical. It required constant adjustment, it restricted the movement of the left arm, and it often required a servant simply to drape it correctly before you could even leave the house.
It is not a garment for a working bureaucracy.
Not at all. As the Byzantine state became more bureaucratic and its ceremonies more complex, the basic silhouette shifted entirely away from draped wrapping and toward constructed tunics and cloaks.
Let's trace how a Byzantine official actually dressed, layer by layer. Starting closest to the skin, the sources indicate both men and women wore a simple undergarment, commonly referred to as a chemise.
Right, this foundational layer was typically white and made of linen or fine wool.
These were the more accessible, less expensive materials available to the general population.
Over that linen chemise, a man would wear a tight-fitting tunic with long sleeves.
And the length of this base tunic was a direct indicator of the wearer's status and daily occupation, right?
Yes, it could range from the knee for agricultural laborers or soldiers all the way down to the ankle for the elites.
Then we reached the middle layers, which is where the strict regulation and decoration really began. Over the tight tunic, an official might wear a dalmatica.
Which was a tunic robe characterized by much looser, wider sleeves.
But for the higher classes and court officials, the middle layer was often the divatesion.
The divatesion is crucial. This is a full-length, long-sleeve silk tunic. It was typically girt at the waist with a belt, pulling the fabric in.
And it served as the primary canvas for extensive decoration. The divatesion featured heavy gold borders at the hem, around the neck, and wrapping around the upper arms.
Moving to the outerwear, the most frequently cited garments in the sources are the paludamentum and the chlamys.
These were heavy cloaks, derived directly from earlier Roman military styles. They were constructed from semicircular or rectangular pieces of really dense fabric.
And the method of wearing the chlamys is highly distinct. It defines the Byzantine visual silhouette.
You didn't just throw it over your shoulders.
No, a wearer did not simply drape a chlamys casually. It was specifically fastened at the right shoulder with an elaborate, heavy brooch or fibula.
That specific fastening point is key. It allowed the bulk of the heavy fabric to fall straight down the body, covering the left arm completely while leaving the right arm relatively free.
We see this silhouette constantly in the mosaics of Ravenna and Constantinople. The right shoulder fastening forces a very stiff, vertical posture.
And this brings us to the embellishments sewn onto these cloaks, which functioned as legally defined markers of status. The most prominent of these was the tablion.
The tablion was a specifically Byzantine invention. It was an oblong or rectangular panel of ornamentation, crafted from contrasting silk, heavy gold thread, enamel, and jewels.
And this panel was sewn directly onto the straight edge of the mantle, positioned about halfway down the front of the body.
Often, a matching panel was sewn onto the back as well.
If you look at the visual evidence, the tablion object, it's almost like a modern military ribbon or a corporate ID badge, but massively scaled up.
That is a good way to look at it.
Its exact color, the material used, and its presence or absence communicated instantaneously to anyone in the court exactly where the wearer stood in the bureaucratic hierarchy.
The sleeves of the underlying tunics were also highly regulated and decorated with elements called segmentum.
These were square, circular, or rectangular applications of heavy embroidery worn directly on the sleeve of the tunic or the dalmatica, adding yet another layer of visual data to the ensemble. This silhouette is fundamentally different from the classical Roman toga. The toga was fluid. It relied entirely on the natural drape of the wool and the constant physical management by the wearer.
The Byzantine silhouette is the exact opposite.
It is stiff, it is heavy, it is fastened firmly in place with heavy metal brooches, and it is encrusted with metallic thread and jewels. I want to push back on the physical reality of this for a moment.
Okay.
Constantinople is situated in the Mediterranean. The climate gets quite warm.
Why?
Wearing multiple layers of heavy jewel-encrusted silk and dense wool seems entirely impractical, if not suffocating, for that environment.
If we judge these garments based on physical comfort, breathability, or mobility, they are entirely dysfunctional.
Completely.
But Byzantine court clothing was never designed for physical labor, walking long distances, or thermal comfort. It was engineered specifically for static, hierarchical display. The physical burden was actually part of the point.
It is about the visual and physical weight of the empire resting on the official.
Yes. Furthermore, the extensive layering served a highly practical economic purpose regarding the preservation of the garments.
Oh, I see.
The underlayers, the less expensive linen chemise, and the simple wool tunics absorbed sweat, body oils, and dirt.
They function as a barrier to protect the outer layers. because you cannot easily wash a divetige that is heavily embroidered with gold wire and freshwater pearls.
You cannot wash it at all without destroying the metalwork and the silk fibers. So the cheaper washable linen layers protected the massive financial investment of the outer pieces.
The sheer physical weight of wearing multiple layers of heavy silk brocade, complete with metallic threads and jeweled appliques, conveyed immense wealth. To bear that literal weight without complaining was to demonstrate that you possess the resources and the favor of the state.
It was a physical performance of loyalty and status.
So we have established the chlamys and the tablion as the rigid markers for high officials and courtiers. But that brings us to the emperor himself.
The center of the entire system.
If his lower-ranking officials are already draped in layers of gold and silk, what garments did the emperor utilize to physically separate himself from the rest of humanity?
That requires an examination of the most sacred and heavily regulated garment in the entire Byzantine wardrobe, the louros.
The louros was the central, defining ceremonial garment of Byzantine imperial attire. Its historical origins trace back to the Roman trabea triumphalis, which was a specific consular robe symbolizing military triumph and supreme authority.
But by the late 6th century, under Justinian, the garment had evolved into a distinctly Byzantine form, stripped of its original Republican Roman context and imbued with new religious meaning.
The physical garment itself was essentially a long, very narrow, scarf-like length of cloth. But describing it as a scarf drastically undersells the reality of it.
It really does.
The sources indicate it was heavily embroidered with continuous gold thread from end to end and almost entirely covered in pearls, precious jewels, and woven religious motifs.
And the construction and draping of the louros evolved significantly over the centuries. In the early period, roughly the 6th century, it still functioned as a wrapped cloth.
It was crossed tightly over the chest in an X formation brought around the back and then draped over the arms.
But by the Middle Byzantine period, spanning the 10th to the 12th centuries, the louros underwent a major structural change. It became much stiffer.
Because the sheer volume of gold wire and jewels applied to the fabric made it virtually impossible to wrap or fold naturally around a human body.
Exactly. The imperial tailors had to adapt the design to accommodate the weight. It evolved from a wrapping cloth into a stiffer, more structured pullover type garment, constructed with a designated opening for the head.
In many cases, it was sewn directly onto the underlying divetige just to keep it anchored and stable during long ceremonies.
The draping of the louros was highly specific and deeply symbolic. Once wrapped around the torso, the long, heavy train of the garment was brought forward and dropped over the left hand or forearm.
This asymmetrical positioning was deliberate. Dropping the immense bulk of the heavily jeweled fabric over the left arm specifically freed the right arm and hand.
The right hand had to be unencumbered for making continuous ritual gestures, blessing the members of the court, or holding specific symbols of state authority.
While the right hand was free to gesture, the left hand, which was actively supporting the weight of the louros train, would hold either the globus crusque, the gold, cross-bearing orb symbolizing Christian authority over the physical world, or an object called the akakia.
The akatia is a vital detail for understanding Byzantine political theology. It was a small, cylindrical pouch made of purple silk, and it was filled with ordinary dust.
I really want to focus on that detail. Amidst the thousands of pearls, the murex purple dye, the gold embroidery, and the massive architectural scale of the Hagia Sophia, the emperor is required to hold a simple pouch of dirt.
The akakia served as a constant physical symbol of human mortality. It was a theological counterbalance.
It was a physical reminder to the emperor, and to everyone watching him, that despite the overwhelming divine trappings of his office and the wealth draped over his body, the man wearing the louros was still mortal.
He was made of dust. He would return to dust, and he remained subject to God's ultimate judgment.
The symbolism of the louros extended far beyond the accessories held in the hand. The garment itself was deeply woven into Christian theology.
In Byzantine religious thought, the louros specifically symbolized Christ's burial shroud or the winding sheet.
Because of this sacred association, it was worn only during the most critical events of the imperial and religious calendar. It was mandatory during coronations at the Hagia Sophia.
The emperor would be formally invested with the garment while standing on the omphalion, a specific, highly decorated marble circle on the floor of the basilica.
It was also required wear during high liturgical services for Easter and Pentecost.
The sources, particularly the 10th century Book of Ceremonies compiled by Constantine, the 7th Porphyry Genitos, outline exhaustive protocols for its use. The loros was reserved exclusively for the emperor, the empress, and designated co-emperors.
No other official, regardless of their rank or wealth, was legally permitted to wear it.
This exclusivity highlights the deeply theatrical nature of Byzantine politics and law. Because the loros was the physical embodiment of the right to rule, manipulating it was a tool of statecraft.
To deny a usurper the loros, or to formally and publicly strip it from an official, was a deliberate, calculated act of humiliation.
It was a visual communication to the entire court, and by extension the empire, that the individual had been stripped of their divine mandate. Without the loros on your shoulders, you are not the emperor.
I want to look closely at the physical toll this took on the wearer. When you look at the physical reality of this entire outfit, the underlying tunic, the heavy silk divetation, the rigid pullover loros layered with gold and jewels, the heavy collar, the closed crown, the person inside it is wrapped so tightly in rigid, heavy fabric that they can barely bend their arms or turn their neck.
It is incredibly restrictive.
If the emperor is essentially immobilized by the weight of his own clothing, doesn't that make him look physically vulnerable rather than powerful?
If we evaluate this through a modern lens or even the lens of an earlier Roman general, yes.
Right.
But in Byzantine ideology, physical agility during a state ceremony was entirely irrelevant.
Because they valued something else entirely.
Right. In their worldview, stillness was the ultimate expression of power.
Stillness as a projection of divine authority.
When wearing the loros in the Hagia Sophia or the throne room, the emperor was not functioning as a warrior on a battlefield. He was functioning as a living icon. He was the viceroy of Christ on earth.
Human beings are flawed. They fidget, they react to cold or fatigue, they shift their weight, they adjust their clothing.
But statues and religious icons do not. The extreme weight and rigidity of the loros forced the emperor to move incredibly slowly, deliberately, or not at all.
This enforced stillness projected an aura of unchanging, eternal, divine order. The physical vulnerability and minor movements of the mortal man were entirely subsumed by the massive, permanent visual weight of the imperial office.
He became an institution rather than just a man.
So the emperor stands perfectly still in the cathedral, projecting divine permanence through his heavily restricted clothing. But the Byzantine Empire did not exist in a vacuum.
Far from it.
It had massive shifting borders, it faced constant pressure from enemies, and it maintained a vast military apparatus. An empire cannot survive if everyone is standing perfectly still.
No, they had to be adaptable.
How did this highly regulated, rigid system of dress adapt to the actual military needs of the state and the inevitable influence of neighboring, often hostile empires?
This is where we see the intense pragmatism of the Byzantine state. The court was deeply orthodox and obsessed with its Roman heritage, but the military leadership was not blind to utility. They constantly adapted to survive.
A perfect example of this cross-pollination in the sources is the adoption of a garment called the tablion.
The tablion represented a major departure from the traditional Byzantine silhouette. It was a long, full-sleeved, caftan-like tunic.
Unlike the traditional Roman or early Byzantine tunics that were pulled over the head and draped, the tablion fastened securely down the front and was worn tightly belted.
And the sources are highly specific about its origins. It was adopted directly from the Islamic world. The 14th century Book of Offices explicitly describes the tablion as Persian in origin.
The timeline of its introduction into the Byzantine court is revealing. The first known reference in the sources occurs around 899, where it is documented specifically as the dress of the hetaria.
The hetaria were the barbarian members of the emperor's elite bodyguard. So initially, this front-fastening caftan is worn exclusively by foreign mercenaries operating within the capital.
But over the centuries, its status shifts. By the mid-14th century, the sources show the tablion had been elevated from mercenary gear to become the standard, highly decorated ceremonial dress for almost all members of the Byzantine court.
It highlights how the Byzantines operated on a practical level. They respected military effectiveness, and they respected utility.
A front-fastening, tightly belted caftan is vastly more practical for riding horses, wielding weapons, and rapid military movement compared to a draped, heavy chlamys or a rigid, restrictive pullover tunic.
They saw a foreign garment design that worked better for their cavalry and their bodyguards, and they absorbed it into their own system.
But they did not just adopt the garment. They completely assimilated it into their own complex visual language.
They took the functional Persian silhouette and rebranded it using Byzantine state resources. They constructed it from heavily regulated state silk, applied massive amounts of gold thread, and added pearls.
The exact rank of the official wearing the tablion dictated its specific color and the legally permitted extent of the gold embroidery on the collar, sleeves, and hem.
We see a very similar pattern of adaptation and regulation with another military garment, the scaramangian.
The scaramangian was a highly decorated riding coat or tunic. It was a garment fundamentally associated with physical mobility, cavalry operations, and military function.
But just like the Kabbadion, it was heavily absorbed into the sumptuary laws. The Book of Ceremonies details how these specific tunics were woven and patterned with potent, state-approved motifs.
Most commonly woven eagles, lions, or griffins.
These were not garments that a wealthy citizen could simply purchase in the markets of Constantinople. The state controlled their distribution.
The emperor awarded specific scaramangia to his generals in direct recognition of outstanding service on the battlefield.
It functioned as a wearable medal of honor, instantly communicating the wearer's military prowess and imperial favor to anyone who saw the specific griffin or eagle motif.
The sources also detail how silk itself functioned as a direct tool of military morale and international diplomacy, far beyond just clothing the generals. The baggage trains of the Byzantine army carried massive amounts of silk textiles into active war zones.
The military commanders used highly visible silk standards to rally troops and signal movements during chaotic engagements.
Because these textiles were incredibly valuable state assets, they were meticulously protected. The sources note they were transported to the battle zone in special purple leather pouches, secured with heavy metal fastenings to protect them from weather and theft.
Beyond the immediate battlefield, this monopoly on silk functioned essentially as an international currency.
When dealing with foreign envoys from Bulgaria, the Rus, Venice, or various powers in the Islamic Mediterranean, the Byzantine emperor would carefully select and gift them specific silk garments.
This practice of silken diplomacy was a calculated geopolitical strategy. First, handing a foreign king a garment worth more than a small town demonstrated the immense, overwhelming wealth and manufacturing capability of the Byzantine state.
Second, by gifting garments of specific cuts, colors, and motifs, the emperor was subtly integrating these foreign rulers into the Byzantine visual hierarchy.
Even if the foreign king returned to his own lands, wearing that garment projected the visual identity and the pageantry of the Byzantine state far beyond its actual physical borders.
A Byzantine outfit, whether it was worn by a foreign diplomat, a decorated general, or the emperor standing in the Hagia Sophia, was not complete merely with the heavy cloth on the torso. The extremities, the head, the hands, and the feet carried equal legal weight under the sumptuary laws and required immense, highly specialized craftsmanship.
Let us examine the headwear first. The imperial crown, known as the stemma, underwent a distinct physical evolution that mirrored the changing shape of the garments.
In the early centuries of the empire, the crown was a relatively simple, open circlet, similar to the laurels or medal bands of earlier Roman emperors.
But by the 11th century, particularly under the Komnenian dynasty, the stemma evolved into a heavy, closed, hemispherical diadem that completely covered the top of the head.
A defining characteristic of the Byzantine stemma, one that clearly distinguishes it from Western crowns, was the pendulia.
These are long, heavy strands, usually constructed of pearls and precious gems, that hung down directly from the sides of the crown.
They framed the wearer's face and fell vertically in front of the ears, sometimes reaching down to the shoulders.
You can see the pendulia clearly depicted in the mosaics of San Vitale and on the coinage of the period. These hanging strands physically added to that static, heavy, vertical visual line we discussed earlier.
They reinforced the stillness, as any sudden movement of the head would cause the heavy pendulia to swing erratically.
For women operating within the court, the headwear was frequently influenced by the Oriental styles that moved through the trade routes. Court women frequently wore turbans, which consisted of a structured cap surrounded by a thick, heavy roll of material.
Alternatively, they might wear a stephanoner. This was a specific type of tiara or jeweled diadem, often paired with a long veil that draped down the back or over the shoulders.
The sources mostly focus on the elite. But what about the common men outside the immediate sphere of the court?
The sumptuary laws restricted their options heavily. Common men generally went bareheaded, wearing their hair closely cropped or bobbed.
Agricultural laborers or farmers might wear a wide-brimmed hat called a petasis, strictly for sun protection while working the fields. but decorative structural headwear was legally reserved for the social elite.
Moving down from the headwear to the jewelry, we find even more severe, legally codified restrictions. The Justinian Code of 529 specifically decreed that certain types of precious gems, namely emeralds, pearls, and sapphires, were reserved for the exclusive legal use of the emperor.
The general population, the plebs, were permitted by the code to wear only a simple gold ring. To wear a pearl necklace or an emerald brooch without imperial permission was a direct violation of the law.
The craftsmanship of the imperial jewelry that we have recovered from archaeological sites and treasury hoards is intensely intricate. Byzantine artisans heavily utilized a technique called opus interracile.
This is a method of creating pierced, highly detailed openwork metal designs. It was a technique that existed in earlier Roman periods, but was elevated to a massive scale in Byzantium for heavy collars and thick bracelets.
They also became masters of cloisonné enamel, particularly from the 9th century onwards.
This highly difficult technique involves soldering tiny wire walls onto a metal base to create small compartments, or cloisons.
These compartments are then filled with colored glass powder and fired in a kiln. This allowed the artisans to create incredibly detailed polychromatic designs, often featuring religious icons or imperial portraits, directly onto heavy gold collars, rings, and the massive brooches used to secure the claims.
Finally, we reach the footwear, which presents what might be the most notable structural contradiction in the entire Byzantine wardrobe.
The sources dictate that Byzantine shoes were constructed of relatively soft materials, utilizing fine, supple leather and heavy cloth.
Because the foundational fabric was soft, the shoes molded directly to the shape of the wearer's toes, or sometimes were constructed to come to a subtle, soft point at the front.
The visual evidence shows men often wearing calf-length boots, while women in the court wore soft shoes with flexible leather soles. These often featured a strap across the instep, secured with a heavily jeweled fastening on the outside of the foot.
The most opulent, legally restricted examples of footwear were the zangia. These were highly embellished boots or shoes, heavily encrusted with pearls and gems, and crucially, they were often dyed a deep crimson.
And the color of the footwear, much like the silk of the tunic, was strictly enforced by the state. Red shoes, or soft boots with specific red details, were an absolute undeniable reference to the emperor and the authority of the early Christian power structure.
But there is a crucial structural detail regarding all Byzantine footwear, regardless of how many pearls were sewn into the leather or how strictly the red dye was regulated.
They had no heels. The shoes were entirely flat.
And when you look at the broader context of European history, this seems like a massive contradiction.
Why spend astronomical wealth and specialized labor covering a shoe in emeralds, gold wire, and murex purple dye, only to make the sole completely flat? In later European history, particularly in the courts of France, monarchs famously wore high heels specifically to boost their height and project physical dominance over their courtiers.
Why did the Byzantines, a culture completely obsessed with visual hierarchy and domination, ignore this obvious physical tool?
This specific detail reveals how the Byzantines fundamentally perceived authority and spatial dynamics. For the Byzantine emperor, physical height attained through a thick shoe sole was entirely irrelevant.
It was unnecessary because of the overwhelming visual impact of the entire ensemble and the physical engineering of the space around him.
The height didn't come from the shoe, it came from the architecture and the accessories.
Exactly that. The towering, closed, hemispherical stemma added significant artificial height to the emperor's silhouette. The long, unbroken vertical lines of the loros drew the viewer's eye constantly upward.
But more importantly, the emperor did not need heels because the very environment of the throne room was engineered to elevate him artificially.
The sources describe the throne room in the Magnara Palace, which featured a mechanical throne.
During formal audiences with foreign diplomats or lower officials, the emperor sat on a massive, complex, mechanical throne. As the foreign envoy approached and was required to prostrate themselves face down on the floor, a practice called proskynesis hidden mechanisms would activate.
Bronze lions flanking the throne would mechanically roar. Artificial birds in a golden tree would sing, and the throne itself would be physically winched up into the air.
The psychological impact of that is staggering.
When the envoy finally raised their head from the marble floor, the emperor, who had been at eye level moments before, was suddenly seated near the ceiling, wrapped in impenetrable gold and purple, completely silent and still.
When the state possesses the engineering capability to physically levitate the emperor toward the roof while foreign kings lie flat on the floor, the thickness of the emperor's shoe sole simply does not matter.
It is entirely superfluous.
So if we step back and look at the entire massive structure we have unpacked today, we have traced a historical and legal path starting from the incredibly labor-intensive extraction of chemical dye from millions of rotting murex sea snails on the shores of the Mediterranean.
We followed that dye into the heavily guarded state workshops and traced how it was applied to silk to create the rigid, heavily armed, icon-like silhouette of an emperor wrapped in the laurels and crowned with a schema.
We have examined how the Byzantine state deliberately abandoned the draped, fluid simplicity of the classical Roman toga. In its place, they engineered a system of heavily structured belted tunics, absorbed front-fastening Persian caftans to supply their military, and utilized heavy cloaks pinned tightly to the shoulder with massive jeweled brooches.
We've explored a society where the basic act of layering your clothing was an economic necessity, where cheap linens absorbed sweat to protect impossibly heavy, gold-embroidered outer garments that could never be washed.
We've looked at a legal system where the state commanded specialized guilds, where the book of the prefect dictated the exact shade of peach-colored silk a merchant was allowed to sell, and where wearing the wrong color or the wrong cut of fabric wasn't a minor social faux pas. It was a capital offense punishable by execution.
Because in the Byzantine worldview, clothing was never just an aesthetic choice or a matter of personal comfort. It was a strictly regulated, legally binding visual language.
The presence of a tablion on a cloak, the specific geometric pattern of a segmentum on a sleeve, the red dye applied to a soft leather shoe, every single physical element communicated a person's exact, legally defined place in both the earthly bureaucracy of the state and the divine hierarchy of the cosmos.
It left absolutely nothing to chance or individual expression.
Which brings us back to that closet we opened at the very start of this deep dive. Today, we use designer brands, specific logos, and rare sneakers to signal our social status, our wealth, or our personal identity. We judge each other based on those choices. But ultimately, we operate in a free market. We can buy and wear whatever we can afford in whatever color we choose.
It is entirely up to the individual.
Consider what our society would look like today if a modern government claimed exclusive legal ownership over a specific color on the spectrum. Imagine if it were a literal capital offense to wear a certain shade of blue, or if a highly durable synthetic fabric was reserved entirely by federal law for the head of state and their immediate circle.
It is a chilling thought.
If the police could raid your home to confiscate a jacket because the collar was cut in a way that mimicked a general's uniform, how would that change the way you look at the clothes hanging in your closet and the complex visual codes of the people walking past you on the street?
It would change everything.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.